Elara wasn't born silent. That's the first thing you need to understand. She wasn't some ethereal, otherworldly creature who graced the royal cradle with an unnerving quiet. No, Elara was a child like any other, gurgling and babbling, reaching out with chubby hands, and generally making the delightful, if sometimes ear-splitting noises that babies do. But somewhere along the line, the music stopped. It wasn't a gradual fading, more like a record scratching abruptly, leaving only a stunned silence in its wake. No one could pinpoint the exact moment, the precise trigger, but it was there, a wall built around her voice, brick by painful brick. Some whispered it was a curse, others blamed the wet nurse, as if a slightly clumsy woman could steal a child's voice. And still others, the more enlightened of the court, mumbled about humors and imbalances. But Elara knew, deep down, in that quiet place where her voice used to be, that it was the day the falcon fell. She was 5, maybe 6. The memory was a kaleidoscope of vibrant colors and terrifying sounds. The royal hunt, a spectacle of pomp and circumstance, was in full swing. Elara, bundled in layers of velvet and fur despite the summer heat, perched beside her nursemaid, more interested in the butterflies flitting through the tall grass than the noble hunters and their magnificent birds. Then it happened. A falcon, the king's favorite, a creature of breathtaking beauty and power, swooped down, talons extended, aiming for a hare. But the hare, in a desperate lunge, darted sideways, and the falcon, missing its mark, collided with a tree branch. The sickening crack echoed through the air, followed by the bird's pitiful cry as it plummeted to the ground, wings twisted at unnatural angles. Elara saw it all. The beautiful creature, broken, its life extinguished in a single horrifying moment. And then the silence descended. Not just the silence of the forest after the hunt, but a silence within her, a silence that swallowed her voice whole. After that day, the words just wouldn't come. She'd open her mouth, try to form the sounds, but nothing emerged. It was like trying to speak underwater. The more she struggled, the more frustrated she became, and the more she retreated into herself. Her parents, the king and queen, initially concerned, soon grew impatient. A silent princess was a liability, a disappointment. Her siblings, sensing their parents' displeasure, took to taunting her, mimicking her attempts to speak, their cruel laughter echoing through the palace corridors. "The silent princess," they'd hiss, their voices dripping with mockery. "Cat got your tongue, Elara?" She learned to avoid them, to become as invisible as her voice. She found solace in the library, losing herself in stories of brave knights and wise queens, imagining herself as a powerful heroine who could command armies and right wrongs. In those stories, she had a voice, a strong, clear voice that everyone listened to. But the real world was a different story. In the real world, she was just Elara, the silent princess, the unseen observer, the girl who no one noticed unless they were looking to make fun of her. She watched the court, a swirling mass of intrigue and ambition. She saw the way her father, the king, manipulated his advisors, how he played them against each other to maintain his power. She saw the queen's shallow vanity, her obsession with appearances and courtly gossip. She saw her siblings' cruelty, their petty rivalries, their constant jockeying for their parents' attention. And she saw how they all underestimated her. They thought her silence was weakness, that her inability to speak meant she was stupid or naive. But Elara saw everything. She absorbed every detail, every nuance of their interactions. She understood their motivations, their desires, their fears. She was a silent observer, a keen student of human nature. And in the quiet of her own mind, she began to form her own opinions, her own plans. She might be silent, but she wasn't blind. She might be overlooked, but she wasn't powerless. The resentment simmered within her, a slow burn that would one day ignite into a consuming flame. The grand hall buzzed with a nervous energy that had nothing to do with the usual courtly gossip or petty rivalries. Even the ever-present musicians seemed to play with a hesitant tremor in their strings. Elara, perched on a tapestry-covered stool in her usual shadowy corner, felt the shift in the air like a change in the wind before a storm. Her father, King Alaric, usually a man of boisterous laughter and booming pronouncements, stood rigid beside the throne, his face grim, his jaw clenched. The queen, ever the picture of serene elegance, fidgeted with the emerald necklace that rested against her pale throat, her eyes darting nervously towards the heavy oak doors. Then the doors swung open, and a hush fell over the assembled courtiers. A messenger, dust staining his travel-worn clothes, strode towards the king, bowing low. He spoke in hushed tones, his words barely audible. Yet Elara saw the way her father's shoulders slumped, the way his grip tightened on the armrest of the throne. The news was not good. And when the messenger departed, the king addressed the court, his voice heavy with forced authority. "My lords and ladies," he began, "we are facing a grave threat. The kingdom of Kelgar, to the north, has amassed its armies at our border. They seek to claim our lands, to plunder our riches, to enslave our people." He paused, letting his words sink in. "We must prepare for war." A ripple of unease spread through the hall. Elara watched the courtiers exchange anxious glances, their whispers like the rustling of leaves in a rising wind. War was a costly endeavor, a bloody affair. It meant sons sent to die, fields left fallow, and the ever-present threat of invasion and destruction. Then the king dropped the bombshell. "To secure our defenses, to forge a powerful alliance," he announced, his voice regaining some of its usual strength. "I have agreed to a union with our neighbors to the west, the kingdom of Ethel. My daughter, Princess Elara, will be wed to their king, Tyrant." The hall erupted in a cacophony of gasps and murmurs. Elara felt a coldness spread through her, a numbness that settled in her stomach like a stone. Tyrant. The name was spoken in hushed tones, a legend whispered in the dark. He was a warrior king, a ruthless conqueror, a man known for his iron fist and his insatiable hunger for power. Rumors of his cruelty abounded, tales of brutal punishments, of dissenters silenced, of enemies crushed beneath his heel. And now she, Elara, the silent princess, the forgotten daughter, was to be his bride. She saw her mother's face, a mask of shock and dismay quickly replaced by a calculating gleam. No doubt the queen was already envisioning the lavish gifts and the political influence that this alliance would bring. Elara's siblings, their faces a mixture of envy and amusement, exchanged sly glances. They knew, as she did, that she was being sacrificed, offered up as a pawn in a game of power and survival. Elara's heart pounded in her chest, a trapped bird fluttering against its cage. She wanted to scream, to protest, to refuse, but the words wouldn't come. They never did. She was trapped, bound by her silence, by her father's ambition, by the cruel whims of fate. A wave of despair washed over her, threatening to drown her in its icy depths. But beneath the despair, a spark ignited, a flicker of resentment that burned hot and fierce. They thought she was weak, a voiceless pawn to be manipulated and discarded. They were wrong. They had no idea what she was capable of. The silent princess might be silent no more. The journey to Ethel was a blur of gray skies and rain-lashed landscapes. Elara, confined to a gilded cage of a carriage, watched the world recede into a tapestry of muted colors and somber shadows. The once familiar countryside, with its rolling hills and vibrant green meadows, gave way to a harsher terrain. Jagged mountains, dark forests, and windswept plains. It was as if the land itself mirrored her own internal landscape, a descent into a bleak and uncertain future. "Do you think he'll be kind?" Anya, Elara's handmaiden, asked tentatively, her voice barely a whisper. Elara, unable to answer, merely shrugged, a gesture that conveyed more resignation than hope. Kindness was not a word associated with King Tyrant. The stories that filtered through the border towns, carried on the whispers of travelers and the songs of bards, painted a portrait of a man forged in fire and ice, a ruler who valued strength above all else, and who showed little mercy to those who crossed him. They arrived at Ethel's capital as dusk was settling, the city's imposing walls and towers silhouetted against a bruised sky. The palace, a sprawling edifice of dark stone and iron, loomed over the city like a predatory beast. Elara, stepping out of the carriage, felt a shiver crawl down her spine, a premonition of the darkness that awaited her within those walls. The court of King Tyrant was a spectacle of both opulence and brutality, The halls were lined with shimmering tapestries and gleaming armor, the tables laden with exotic delicacies and glittering jewels. Yet, beneath the veneer of luxury, a current of cruelty ran through the court like a poisoned stream. Elara, observing from her usual silent perch, witnessed the casual disregard for human life, the petty power struggles, the sycophantic fawning over the king. She saw courtiers humiliated, guards punished for minor infractions, and servants cowering in fear. This was a court where power was the only currency, and where mercy was a weakness. Theron himself was a formidable presence. Tall and broad-shouldered, with a mane of dark hair and eyes that burned with an icy fire, he commanded attention with every stride. His voice when he spoke was a deep rumble that resonated through the hall, silencing any dissent. He was a warrior king, a man who ruled through fear and intimidation. Elara, watching him from afar, felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. Among the courtiers, several figures stood out. Lord Valerius, the king's chief advisor, was a man of sharp intelligence and cunning ambition. His eyes, like those of a hawk, missed nothing, and his whispers held the power to sway the king's decisions. Lady Isolde, Theron's favorite, was a woman of striking beauty and ruthless ambition. She used her influence over the king to advance her own agenda, crushing anyone who stood in her way. And then there was Cale, the captain of the guard, a man of quiet strength and unwavering loyalty. He seemed to observe Elara with a thoughtful gaze, his eyes betraying a hint of curiosity, perhaps even sympathy. Elara, the silent princess, the unseen observer, found herself in a den of wolves. She was surrounded by predators, each vying for power, each willing to use any means necessary to achieve their goals. But Elara was not the naive girl they thought her to be. She had learned to observe, to analyze, to understand the hidden currents of power. And in the darkness of Theron's court, she would find her voice, a voice that would shake the foundations of their world. "Well, well, well," Theron drawled, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "The silent princess has finally arrived. I was starting to think you were a figment of my advisor's imaginations." He leaned closer, his breath hot against Elara's cheek. Or perhaps they just sent me a particularly useless doll. Elara, standing rigid beside him at the head of the banquet table, felt a wave of nausea wash over her. The hall was filled with the raucous laughter of Theron's courtiers, their eyes glued to her like vultures circling a dying animal. She could feel their amusement, their disdain, their eagerness to witness her humiliation. She longed to disappear, to melt into the shadows, but Theron's grip on her arm was like a vice, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Cat got your tongue, princess?" he sneered, his voice echoing through the hall. "Or are you just too stupid to speak?" A ripple of laughter spread through the crowd. Elara's face burned with shame, but she kept her gaze fixed on the tapestry behind Theron's head, a scene of a huntress slaying a lion. She clung to the image, to the idea of strength and defiance, even as her body trembled with fear. Life with Theron was a relentless torment. He delighted in humiliating her, in exposing her silence as a weakness. He would mock her at every opportunity, his words like daggers aimed at her heart. "My silent wife," he'd announced to his guests, "a rare treasure indeed. She never interrupts, never complains, never has an opinion of her own." And then he'd laugh, a cruel booming sound that echoed through the palace halls. His cruelty wasn't confined to words. He would strike her in fits of rage, his blows leaving bruises that bloomed like dark flowers on her skin. He would lock her in her chambers for days, denying her food and water, her only company the rats that scurried in the shadows. He would force her to attend his feasts, to sit beside him as he entertained his guests with tales of his conquests, her silence a testament to his power. Elara endured it all with an outward stoicism that masked a growing rage. She learned to anticipate his moods, to avoid his wrath, to become a ghost in her own life. But inside, she was seething. Every insult, every blow, every humiliation fueled a fire within her, a fire that burned with a cold, consuming intensity. She observed the court, its intricate web of alliances and betrayals. She saw the fear in the eyes of the courtiers, the desperation of those who had fallen out of favor. She saw the way Theron manipulated them, playing them against each other to maintain his grip on power. She learned their secrets, their weaknesses, their vulnerabilities. She was a silent observer, a spider patiently weaving her web. "You think you can break me," she thought to herself one night, her voice a raspy sound that scraped against the silence of her own mind. "You think you can silence me forever. But you're wrong. I'm learning, I'm watching, and I'm waiting." She would not be a victim. She would not be silenced. She would rise from the ashes of her own destruction, a phoenix reborn from the flames of her suffering. She would find her voice, a voice that would shatter the foundations of Theron's kingdom, a voice that would demand justice, a voice that would usher in a new era of power. The Grand Hall was a whirlwind of revelry. Torches blazed, casting dancing shadows on the richly woven tapestries that adorned the walls. The air was thick with the scent of roasted meats, spiced wine, and the heady perfume of exotic flowers. Laughter and music mingled with the clatter of goblets and the boisterous chatter of the courtiers. But Elara, seated beside Theron at the head of the long table, felt none of the festive cheer. Her heart was a leaden weight in her chest, her stomach churning with a sickening dread. Theron, flushed with wine and victory, he'd just returned from a successful raid on a neighboring village, his army laden with plunder, was in a particularly jovial mood. He regaled his guests with tales of his exploits, his voice booming through the hall, his laughter echoing off the vaulted ceiling. Elara, however, saw only the bloodstains on his armor, the flicker of cruelty in his eyes, the barely concealed contempt in his smile. "And then," Theron roared, slamming his fist on the table, sending a goblet flying, "the village elder, a pathetic old man, dared to defy me. Can you imagine? He actually had the audacity to suggest that I should pay for the grain we took." The courtiers erupted in laughter, their faces flushed with amusement. Elara, however, felt a chill crawl down her spine. She knew what was coming. "So," Theron continued, his voice dropping to a menacing growl, "I taught him a lesson he wouldn't forget. He paused, his eyes sweeping across the hall, finally settling on Elara. A cruel smile twisted his lips. "I had his tongue cut out." A collective gasp filled the hall, followed by a stunned silence. Alara's breath caught in her throat, her eyes widening in horror. She could see the scene vividly in her mind. The terrified old man, his mouth agape, the blood gushing from his mutilated tongue. She felt a wave of nausea wash over her, the room tilting precariously. Theron, mistaking her shock for amusement, leaned closer, his breath hot against her ear. "What do you think, my silent wife?" he whispered, his voice laced with mockery. "Perhaps we should try that on you. Then you'd truly be the silent princess, wouldn't you?" He threw back his head and roared with laughter, the sound grating on Elara's ears like nails on a chalkboard. The courtiers, sensing the king's amusement, joined in, their laughter echoing through the hall like a chorus of demons. Elara, unable to bear it any longer, pushed back her chair and stumbled to her feet, but Theron had her hair in his grip, slamming her head like a hammer on the rigid table. How dare you walk away from me?" he shouted as his fist continued to pummel her beautiful face, blood splattering across the table. "Leave her be, Theron!" a voice boomed from the other end of the table. Kale, the captain of the guard, stood, his face grim, his eyes fixed on the king. Theron, his laughter dying in his throat, glared at Kale. "What did you say?" he snarled, his voice laced with menace. "You heard me," Kale replied, his voice steady. "Leave the princess alone." Theron, his face contorted with rage, surged to his feet. "You dare to defy me?" he roared, reaching for the dagger at his belt. But before he could draw it, Elara crumpled to the floor, her body racked with tremors, her eyes rolled back in her head, her breath coming in ragged gasps. The laughter in the hall died abruptly, replaced by a stunned silence. "Elara!" Kale shouted, rushing to her side. He knelt beside her, his hand hovering over her lifeless form. "Someone get a healer!" But it was too late. Elara's spirit had fled, her body a broken shell. The silent princess, silenced forever. Or so they thought. Elara floated in a void, a sea of nothingness that stretched endlessly in all directions. There was no light, no darkness, no sensation of time or space, only a profound sense of emptiness, a chilling isolation that seeped into her very being. Was this death? She wondered, her thoughts echoing in the vast emptiness. Was this the oblivion that awaited her after a lifetime of silence and suffering? Then, a voice. It wasn't a sound that reached her ears, for there were no ears in this void, no body to perceive the vibrations of the air. It was a voice that resonated within her soul, a presence that filled the emptiness with a strange, compelling energy. Elara, the voice called, its tone neither male nor female, neither kind nor cruel. It was simply there, a force of nature, an undeniable presence. Elara, startled, tried to speak, to question, to demand answers. But her voice, as always, failed her. She was trapped in her silence, even in this strange, ethereal realm. You have lived a life of silence, the voice continued, its words echoing through the void, a life of pain, of humiliation, of powerlessness. Elara felt a surge of emotions. Anger, resentment, grief. The voice had spoken the truth, a truth she had buried deep within herself, a truth she had tried to ignore. But silence need not be your fate, the voice said, its tone shifting, a hint of something akin to promise. You have the power within you to break free, to claim your rightful place, to shape your own destiny. Elara's non-existent heart quickened. Power? What power? She was a broken doll, discarded and forgotten. What power could she possibly possess? The power of your voice, the voice answered, as if reading her thoughts. The voice you were denied, the voice you craved, the voice that will command obedience. Elara felt a tremor run through her, a spark igniting in the emptiness. A voice? A voice that could command? Was this a cruel joke, a mockery of her deepest longing? No joke, Elara, the voice said, its tone firm, resolute. This is your chance. Accept this gift, and you will rise from the ashes. You will become the queen you were meant to be. You will rule with an iron fist, and your enemies will tremble before you. Elara hesitated. The offer was tempting, seductive. The power to command, to control, to make those who had wronged her pay. But at what cost? Was this a divine gift, a blessing from the gods? Or was it something darker? A pact with forces she didn't understand, a path that would lead her to a different kind of darkness. The voice seemed to sense her hesitation. The choice is yours, Elara, it said, its tone softer now, almost coaxing. Embrace your power, or remain in silence forever. Elara felt a surge of defiance, a spark of rebellion that had been dormant for too long. She would not be silenced. She would not be a victim. She would seize this chance, this power, this destiny. I accept, she whispered, her voice echoing in the void, a voice filled with newfound strength and determination. And with that single word, the void shattered, and Elara was pulled back into the world of the living, a world she would now rule. Elara opened her eyes, and the world rushed back in. The heavy velvet drapes, the flickering candlelight, the scent of stale incense. She was in her chambers, the same suffocatingly opulent prison she'd known for countless days. But something was undeniably different. A tingling energy thrummed beneath her skin, a newfound awareness that pulsed in her veins. And then she realized she could feel her voice, coiled within her throat, a vibrant, living thing. She sat up, the movement surprisingly effortless, and whispered, "Hello?" The word echoed in the silence of the room, but it wasn't the sound that startled her. It was the feeling, the power that resonated within the word, a subtle vibration that seemed to ripple outwards, touching the very fabric of the room. A thrill, a mixture of fear and exhilaration coursed through her. This was no ordinary voice. This was the voice of command, the voice of power, the voice she had been promised. A tentative knock sounded at the door. "My lady?" a hesitant voice called. It was Anya, her handmaiden, her voice laced with concern. "Are you awake?" "Come in, Anya," Elara said, her voice stronger now, imbued with a subtle force that she couldn't quite explain. Anya entered, her eyes wide with surprise. "My lady, you're speaking?" Elara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. "I am." Anya rushed to her side, her hands fluttering nervously. Are you feeling all right? Do you need anything? Should I call for the healer? I'm fine, Anya, Elara assured her, her voice calm and steady. Just a little tired. Anya, still fussing, helped Elara into a sitting position and began to brush her hair. Elara, watching her in the mirror, decided to test the limits of her newfound power. Anya, she said, her voice taking on a slightly firmer tone, would you mind fetching me a glass of water? Anya, who was usually quite talkative, stopped mid-sentence and immediately turned towards the door. Of course, my lady, she said, her voice strangely devoid of its usual inflection. She hurried out of the room, leaving Elara alone with her thoughts. Elara leaned back against the pillows, a slow smile spreading across her face. It worked. Her voice held a power, a subtle compulsion that seemed to override Anya's own will. It wasn't a forceful command, more like a gentle nudge, a suggestion that couldn't be refused. She spent the next few days experimenting, testing the boundaries of her power. She found she could influence the servants, getting them to perform tasks without question, to anticipate her needs before she even voiced them. She could sway the guards, eliciting information about the palace, about Theron's movements, about the court's secrets. She even managed to subtly influence Lord Valerius, the king's advisor, during a brief encounter in the hallway, planting a seed of doubt about Theron's latest military strategy. The more she used her voice, the stronger it seemed to become. The compulsion grew more potent, the obedience more immediate. She could feel the power coursing through her, a heady sensation that both thrilled and terrified her. She was no longer the silent princess, the unseen observer. She was a force to be reckoned with, a queen in the making, and with this newfound power, she would reshape her destiny, rewrite the rules of the game, and claim her rightful place in the world. Elara, no longer a passive observer, moved through the court like a phantom, her presence barely noticed, her influence subtly growing. She was a whisper in the shadows, a seed of doubt planted in fertile minds, a catalyst for the discontent that simmered beneath the surface of Theron's iron-fisted rule. Her first target was Lord Valerius, the king's shrewd advisor, a man whose ambition was as boundless as his intellect. She found him in the library, surrounded by scrolls and maps, his brow furrowed in concentration. Lord Valerius, she said, her voice soft yet carrying an undeniable weight. Valerius looked up, startled. Your Majesty, he said, bowing his head. I didn't hear you approach. I have something important to discuss with you, Elara said, her voice laced with a subtle urgency. Valerius, intrigued, gestured towards a nearby table. Please, Your Majesty, have a seat. Elara sat, her gaze fixed on Valerius. I'm concerned about the king's recent military campaign, she began, her voice carefully measured. His tactics seem reckless. Valerius frowned. Reckless, Your Majesty? Indeed, Elara continued, her voice taking on a persuasive tone. Attacking the neighboring villages will only serve to unite them against us. It's a strategy that risks a prolonged and costly war. Valerius, a man who prided himself on his strategic thinking, felt a flicker of doubt. The king's recent actions had been impulsive, driven more by a desire for plunder than a sound military strategy. Elara's words, though subtly delivered, resonated with his own concerns. I understand your concerns, Your Majesty, Valerius said, his voice thoughtful. I will advise the king accordingly. Elara nodded, a small smile playing on her lips. The seed had been planted. Her next target was Lady Isolde, Theron's favorite, a woman whose beauty was matched only by her ruthlessness. Elara found her in the gardens, surrounded by a gaggle of admirers, her laughter echoing through the manicured lawns. Lady Isolde, Elara said, her voice cutting through the laughter. Isolde turned, her eyes narrowing. Your Majesty, she said, her voice laced with a hint of disdain. To what do I owe the pleasure? I've been admiring your influence over the king, Elara said, her voice laced with a subtle mockery. Isolde's eyes narrowed further. Influence? Indeed, Elara continued, her voice taking on a conspiratorial tone. You seem to have a remarkable ability to persuade him. Perhaps you could use your influence to guide him towards a more prudent course of action. Isolde, a woman who thrived on power and control, felt a surge of annoyance. Was this silent princess suggesting that she was manipulating the king? The audacity. "I assure you, your majesty," Isolde said, her voice dripping with venom, "I have the king's best interests at heart." Elara smiled. A knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Of course you do, Lady Isolde," she said, her voice laced with a subtle threat. "But it would be a shame if the king were to misinterpret your intentions." Isolde's face paled. Elara's words, though veiled, struck a nerve. She knew that her influence over Theron was waning, that his affections were fickle. Elara's insinuation that she might be plotting against him was a dangerous accusation, one that could easily lead to her downfall. Elara, satisfied with the effect she had produced, turned and walked away, leaving Isolde to stew in her own paranoia. She continued her campaign of whispers, moving through the court like a shadow, planting seeds of doubt, amplifying discontent, creating divisions. She spoke to the disgruntled nobles, the ambitious courtiers, the neglected advisors, each time using her voice to subtly manipulate their perceptions, to turn them against Theron. "The king is losing his grip," she'd murmur, her voice laced with concern. "He's become reckless, unpredictable. He's leading us to ruin." "He doesn't value your loyalty," she'd whisper, her voice filled with understanding. "He only cares for himself, for his own power." "You deserve better," she'd say, her voice laced with a hint of promise. "You deserve a ruler who respects you, who values your contributions." Her words, like drops of water on stone, slowly eroded the foundations of Theron's power. The court, once a monolithic entity, began to fracture, its loyalties shifting, its alliances crumbling. The whispers of rebellion grew louder, bolder, more daring, and Elara, the silent princess, the unseen observer, watched it all unfold, a small smile playing on her lips. The game was afoot, and she was the puppet master, pulling the strings, orchestrating the downfall of the tyrant king. The air in the grand hall crackled with a tension that was thicker than the velvet drapes adorning the walls. The feast, ostensibly a celebration of Theron's latest victory, another brutal raid on a defenseless village, felt more like a wake. The laughter was forced, the toasts hollow, the atmosphere heavy with unspoken anxieties. Elara, seated beside Theron, observed the scene with a quiet satisfaction. Her whispers had done their work. The seeds of rebellion, carefully sown, had finally taken root. The time for action had come. Theron, predictably, was drunk and boisterous, regaling his courtiers with exaggerated tales of his heroism. He gestured wildly, sloshing wine on the table, his face flushed with arrogance and self-satisfaction. He was oblivious to the subtle shifts in the room, the way the courtiers' eyes flickered towards Elara, the almost imperceptible nods exchanged between key figures. He was a lion, bloated with pride, unaware that the pack was turning against him. Elara, outwardly demure, inwardly seethed with a controlled fury. She had endured years of humiliation, abuse, and terror at this man's hands. Tonight she would have her revenge. Tonight the tyrant would fall. She took a slow, deliberate sip of her wine, her gaze sweeping across the hall, taking in every detail. Lord Valerius, standing near the entrance, gave her a subtle nod. Lady Isolde, her face pale and drawn, avoided her eyes. Kale, the captain of the guard, stood at his usual post near the throne, his expression unreadable. Elara met his gaze, and a silent understanding passed between them. The plan was in motion. Theron, mid-sentence, suddenly grabbed Elara's arm, his grip bruisingly tight. "My silent queen," he slurred, his breath hot and foul against her cheek. "Why so quiet? Aren't you enjoying the festivities?" Elara, outwardly calm, met his gaze with a chilling intensity. "I'm enjoying the anticipation, Your Majesty," she said, her voice soft, yet laced with an undeniable power. Theron, momentarily confused by her tone, frowned. Anticipation? What anticipation? Before he could press the matter, Elara spoke again, her voice ringing through the hall, silencing the boisterous chatter. "The anticipation of justice," she said, her voice now amplified, imbued with the supernatural force that compelled obedience. A hush fell over the hall. Theron's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed with anger. Justice? What are you talking about? He snarled. Elara rose to her feet, her movements graceful, yet purposeful. She stepped away from Theron, her gaze sweeping across the assembled courtiers. For too long, she said, her voice resonating with a chilling authority, this kingdom has suffered under the reign of a tyrant, a man who values cruelty over compassion, power over justice, and his own selfish desires over the well-being of his people. The courtiers exchanged nervous glances, their faces a mixture of fear and anticipation. Theron, his face flushed with rage, lunged towards Elara, his hand reaching for the dagger at his belt. "You dared to speak to me like that?" he roared. But before he could reach her, Elara raised her hand, her voice cutting through the air like a whip. "Guards," she commanded, her voice laced with irresistible power. "Seize him!" The royal guards, who only moments before had sworn loyalty to Theron, moved as one. They surged towards the king, their faces blank, their movements robotic. Theron, stunned by their sudden betrayal, struggled against them, his roars of anger turning into cries of disbelief. He looked towards his courtiers for support, but they remained frozen, their eyes fixed on Elara, their faces filled with a mixture of awe and terror. What is the meaning of this?" Theron stammered, his voice trembling with fear. Elara descended the steps, her eyes fixed on the struggling king. "The meaning of justice, Your Majesty," she said, her voice ringing with cold authority. "The meaning of a new era for this kingdom." She reached Theron, who was now being held firmly by the guards. He looked at her, his eyes pleading, his face contorted with fear. "Elara, please, have mercy," he begged, his voice a pathetic whimper. Elara looked at him, her face devoid of emotion. "You showed me no mercy," she said, her voice flat, emotionless. "Why should I show you any?" She turned to the guards. "Take him away," she commanded, her voice laced with finality. "Imprison him. He will be judged for his crimes." The guards dragged Theron away, his cries echoing through the hall, a fitting end to the reign of the tyrant king. Elara stood alone, at the head of the hall, her gaze sweeping across the assembled courtiers. They looked at her with a mixture of fear and awe, their faces reflecting the dawn of a new era. An era ruled by the silent princess, now the tyrant queen. Silence descended upon the hall, heavy and expectant. The courtiers, still reeling from the swift overthrow of Theron, shifted nervously, their gazes darting between Elara and the empty throne. The air crackled with uncertainty, a palpable shift in the balance of power. Elara, standing tall and resolute, savored the moment. This was her kingdom now, her court, her destiny. "My lords and ladies," she began, her voice ringing with newfound authority, "the tyrant has fallen. His reign of terror is over. A new era has begun." A collective gasp filled the hall, followed by a ripple of murmurs. Elara, the silent princess, the unseen observer, was now their queen. The transformation was as startling as it was swift. "I know that many of you feared Theron," Elara continued, her voice softening slightly, "and with good reason. He ruled through fear and intimidation, crushing any dissent, silencing any opposition. But I will not rule in the same way." She paused, letting her words sink in. The courtiers, sensing a change in the wind, leaned forward, their eyes fixed on her. "I will rule with justice and compassion," Elara declared, her voice resonating with a sincerity that surprised even herself. "I will listen to your concerns, I will value your counsel, and I will work tirelessly to ensure the prosperity and security of this kingdom." And a wave of relief washed over the courtiers. Elara's words, though unexpected, were a welcome balm after years of Theron's oppressive rule. They had expected a continuation of tyranny, a new face on the old regime. Instead, they were being offered a chance for a fresh start, a chance to participate in the shaping of their own destiny. Elara, a shrewd strategist, knew that consolidating her power would require more than just words. She needed to act decisively to demonstrate her strength, to eliminate any lingering doubts about her authority, and she needed to do it quickly, before any opposition could coalesce. Her first act as queen was to address the grievances of the people. She abolished Theron's most hated taxes, released political prisoners, and ordered the restoration of lands and properties that had been unjustly seized. These actions, though seemingly simple, sent a powerful message throughout the kingdom. The tyrant was gone, and a new era of justice and fairness had begun. Next, she turned her attention to the court itself. She dismissed Theron's most loyal advisors, replacing them with individuals known for their competence and integrity. She stripped Lady Isolde of her titles and privileges, banishing her from the court. And she rewarded those who had supported her, elevating them to positions of power and influence. But Elara knew that some of Theron's loyalists remained, lurking in the shadows, waiting for an opportunity to strike back. She couldn't afford to be complacent. She needed to eliminate any potential threats to ensure that her rule was absolute and unchallenged. She summoned Kale, the captain of the guard, to her chambers. "Kale," she said, her voice firm, yet laced with a hint of gratitude. "You have served this kingdom faithfully, even under the rule of a tyrant. I trust your judgment, your loyalty, your discretion." Kale, a man of few words, bowed his head. "Your Majesty," he said, his voice gruff yet respectful. "There are still those who remain loyal to Theron," Elara continued, her voice taking on a steely edge. "They pose a threat to the stability of this kingdom, to my rule. I need you to deal with them." Kale understood. He had witnessed Theron's cruelty firsthand, had seen the fear and suffering he had inflicted upon the people. He had no qualms about eliminating those who would seek to perpetuate that tyranny. "It will be done, Your Majesty," Kale said, his voice resolute. Elara nodded, a grim satisfaction settling in her heart. She was not a cruel ruler, but she was a pragmatic one. She would do what was necessary to secure her power, to protect her kingdom, to fulfill her destiny. The days that followed were a whirlwind of activity. Elara, with Kale's assistance, systematically eliminated any remaining opposition. Some were imprisoned, others exiled, and a few, the most dangerous, met a swift and silent end. Elara, using her voice to uncover conspiracies and to extract confessions, ensured that no threat went unaddressed. By the time the dust settled, Elara's rule was absolute. The court, once a hotbed of intrigue and treachery, was now firmly under her control. The whispers of rebellion had been silenced, replaced by a grudging respect, a growing admiration for the queen who had risen from the ashes of tyranny. Elara, the silent princess, the unseen observer, had become Elara, the tyrant queen, the undisputed ruler of Ethel. And as she surveyed her kingdom, a new ambition began to take root in her heart, an ambition that would lead her to even greater heights of power. The messenger arrived as Elara was reviewing reports on the kingdom's grain reserves, a stark contrast to the frivolous courtly gossip that used to dominate her days. He was a bedraggled figure, his clothes dusty, his face etched with exhaustion. He knelt before her, his voice trembling as he delivered the news. "Your Majesty," he stammered, "a message from King Alaric." Elara raised an eyebrow, a flicker of amusement crossing her lips. Her father, the man who had treated her as an inconvenience, a pawn to be sacrificed for political gain. What could he possibly want from her now? "Speak," she commanded, her voice laced with a subtle authority that brooked no hesitation. The messenger, his eyes wide with fear, fumbled with the scroll in his hands. "King Alaric, he requests, no, he begs, for your assistance." Elara's amusement deepened. Begs? Her father, the mighty King Alaric, reduced to begging? The irony was delicious. "Assistance with what?" she asked, her voice deceptively casual. "The war, Your Majesty," the messenger blurted out. "The Kelgarians. They have breached our defenses. They are advancing on the capital." Elara leaned back in her chair, a thoughtful expression on her face. So, the Kelgarians were winning. It seemed her father's strategic brilliance was no match for their brute force. A small, vindictive part of her reveled in his misfortune. "And what makes King Alaric think that I would be willing to help him?" she asked, her voice laced with a hint of steel. The messenger, his face pale, stammered. He believes that as his daughter, you have a duty." Elara cut him off with a wave of her hand. "Duty? He speaks of duty, the man who married me off to a tyrant, who condemned me to a life of misery and abuse. He dares to speak of duty." The messenger, cowering before her wrath, could only shake his head. Elara rose from her chair, her gaze fixed on the messenger. "Tell King Alaric," she said, her voice cold and resolute, "that I will consider his request. But he, and my dear family, must come here, to Ethel. They must plead their case in person." The messenger, relieved to escape with his life, bowed deeply and scurried out of the room. Elara watched him go, a grim smile playing on her lips. Her family, the people who had mocked her, belittled her, and discarded her, were coming to her, hat in hand, begging for her help. The tables had turned, and she intended to savor every moment of their humiliation. A week later, King Alaric arrived, accompanied by the queen and Elara's siblings. They were a pathetic sight. The king, once a proud and imposing figure, was now stooped and haggard, his face etched with worry. The queen, her beauty faded, her eyes red-rimmed, looked like a ghost of her former self. And Elara's siblings, their arrogance replaced by fear, cowered behind their parents. They were ushered into the throne room, where Elara awaited them, seated on the throne that had once belonged to Tyrant. She looked at them, her gaze sweeping over their faces, taking in their fear, their desperation, their shame. "Father," she said, her voice laced with a chilling formality, "mother, siblings, welcome to Ethel." King Alaric, his voice trembling, stepped forward. "Elara," he began, we are in dire need of your assistance. The Calgarians, they are overrunning our kingdom. Our people are suffering. We need your help." Elara remained silent, her gaze fixed on her father. She let his words hang in the air, the silence amplifying their desperation. The queen, unable to bear the tension, stepped forward, her eyes filled with tears. "Elara, please," she pleaded. "We know we haven't always treated you well, but we are your family. We need you." Elara's siblings, their faces pale, echoed their mother's pleas. "Elara, please help us," they begged. "We're sorry for how we treated you." Elara, watching them grovel, felt a surge of satisfaction. They were finally acknowledging her, recognizing her power, pleading for her mercy. But their apologies were hollow, their remorse insincere. They were motivated by fear, not love. "Very well," Elara said, her voice cold and resolute. "I will help you, but it will come at a price." King Alaric, his eyes lighting up with hope, nodded eagerly. "Anything, Elara. We will pay any price." Elara smiled, a cruel, vindictive smile that sent shivers down their spines. "Excellent," she said, her voice laced with a chilling promise. "Then, let us discuss the terms of our agreement. Ethel will join forces with Alaric against the Calgarian invaders," Elara declared, her voice echoing through the War Council chamber. Her father, along with her siblings and a handful of their advisors, sat opposite her, their faces etched with a mixture of relief and apprehension. They had expected a steep price for her aid, but the true cost had yet to be revealed. However, Elara continued, her gaze sweeping across their anxious faces, "My support comes with certain conditions." King Alaric, desperate to secure her aid, readily agreed. "Name your conditions, Elara. Anything." Elara's lips curled into a chilling smile. "Firstly, I will lead the combined armies. My generals, my strategies, my command." A flicker of unease crossed Alaric's face. He had expected to retain control of his forces, but Elara's demand was non-negotiable. He had no choice but to acquiesce. "Secondly," Elara continued, her voice hardening, "I want control of the Calgarian prisoners of war. All of them." This was an unusual demand, but Alaric, eager to secure her military support, agreed without hesitation. He had no idea what Elara planned to do with the prisoners, but he trusted her ruthlessness. Perhaps she intended to use them as bargaining chips or as a source of forced labor. Whatever her intentions, he was in no position to question them. Elara, satisfied with her father's acquiescence, outlined the final condition. "And lastly," she said, her voice laced with a chilling finality, "upon victory, I will claim half of your kingdom as my own." A collective gasp filled the room. Alaric's face paled, his eyes widening in disbelief. "Half?" he stammered. "Elara, that's preposterous!" Elara's smile widened, revealing a hint of the predator beneath the polished facade. Preposterous, is it? Perhaps, but those are my terms. Take them or leave them. Alaric, trapped between the encroaching Calgarian forces and Elara's ruthless ambition, had no choice. He gritted his teeth and nodded curtly. Agreed. Elara, her victory secured, rose from her chair. Excellent, she said, her voice laced with a chilling satisfaction. Then let the war begin. The combined armies of Ethel and Alaric marched north, a formidable force led by the warrior queen, Elara. She proved to be a brilliant strategist, her tactics unorthodox yet devastatingly effective. She used her knowledge of the terrain to her advantage, setting ambushes, outmaneuvering the enemy, and exploiting their weaknesses. She was ruthless in her command, demanding absolute obedience from her soldiers. Those who faltered, who questioned her orders, were swiftly punished, their fear serving as a warning to others. Yet, she also inspired a fierce loyalty in her troops. They had witnessed her courage on the battlefield, her unwavering determination, her willingness to fight alongside them, to share their hardships. They called her the Silent Storm, a force of nature that swept across the battlefield, leaving destruction in its wake. The war raged for months, a bloody and brutal affair, but Elara, with her strategic brilliance and her ruthless command, gradually turned the tide. She led her forces to victory after victory, pushing the Calgarians back, reclaiming lost territory, and inflicting heavy casualties. In a final decisive battle, Elara's forces surrounded the Calgarian army, trapping them in a valley. She unleashed the full fury of her army upon them, a relentless assault that broke their lines and shattered their morale. The Calgarian king, desperate to avoid capture, led a suicidal charge against Elara's position. He was met by Elara herself, who, wielding a sword with surprising skill, cut him down in single combat. The Calgarian army, leaderless and demoralized, surrendered. Elara, standing amidst the carnage, her armor stained with blood, surveyed the scene with a grim satisfaction. The war was over, and she had emerged victorious. She had proven herself not only as a ruler, but as a warrior, a commander, a conqueror. And as she looked towards the south, towards her father's kingdom, a new ambition burned in her eyes. She had claimed half of his kingdom as her price, and she intended to collect. The grand hall of Alaric's palace was ablaze with light and merriment. Garlands of flowers and banners of victory adorned the walls, while long tables groaned under the weight of roasted meats, overflowing platters of fruit, and glistening flagons of wine. Musicians played lively tunes, their melodies mingling with the boisterous laughter and chatter of the assembled guests. It was a celebration, a victory feast in honor of Elara, the warrior queen who had delivered them from the Calgarian invaders. Elara, seated at the high table beside her father, surveyed the scene with a detached amusement. Her family, oblivious to her true intentions, were basking in the glow of their perceived triumph. Alaric, his face flushed with wine and pride, regaled his courtiers with tales of Elara's battlefield exploits, embellishing them with each retelling. The queen, resplendent in jewels and silks, beamed at her daughter, her eyes filled with a maternal pride that Elara found both ironic and nauseating. Her siblings, their earlier fear replaced by a grudging admiration, vied for her attention, eager to bask in the reflected glory of her victory. They believed they were safe, that Elara had forgiven them for their past transgressions, that their familial bonds had been reforged in the crucible of war. They were wrong. Elara had not forgotten, nor had she forgiven. She had merely postponed her vengeance, biding her time, waiting for the opportune moment to strike. The feast reached its crescendo. Alaric, raising his goblet high, called for silence. "To Elara," he boomed, his voice echoing through the hall, "the warrior queen, the savior of our kingdom." The guests erupted in cheers, their goblets clinking together in a cacophony of celebration. Elara, her lips curled into a sardonic smile, raised her own goblet in a mocking salute. This was her moment. "Thank you, father," she said, her voice cutting through the cheers, silencing the hall. "I appreciate your kind words and your gratitude." Alaric, beaming, nodded. "It is well deserved, my daughter. You have saved our kingdom. We are forever in your debt." Elara's smile widened, revealing a hint of the predator beneath the polished facade. "Indeed, you are," she said, her voice laced with a chilling finality. "And it is time for you to repay that debt." Confusion rippled through the hall. Alaric's smile faltered, his eyes narrowing in suspicion. "Repay? What do you mean, Elara?" Elara rose from her chair, her gaze sweeping across the assembled guests. "I believe it is time," she announced, her voice ringing with authority, "to discuss the terms of our agreement." The festive atmosphere evaporated, replaced by a palpable tension. The music faltered, the laughter died, the chatter ceased. The guests, sensing a shift in the wind, exchanged nervous glances, their faces etched with apprehension. Elara, savoring the moment, continued. "As you all know, I agreed to assist my father in repelling the Kelgarian invaders. However, my support came with a price." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, the silence amplifying the growing dread. "That price," she declared, her voice resonating with a chilling power, "is the annexation of half of this kingdom. From this day forth, I, Elara, Queen of Ethel, also claim dominion over the southern provinces, the fertile lands, the bustling cities, and the loyal subjects that reside within them." A collective gasp filled the hall. Alaric's face turned ashen, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Elara!" he stammered, his voice trembling with rage. You cannot be serious!" Elara's smile hardened. "I assure you, Father, I am quite serious. The terms of our agreement were clear. You agreed to them freely." The queen, her face pale, let out a choked cry. Elara's siblings, their earlier admiration replaced by fear, cowered behind their parents. The guests, caught in the crossfire, shifted uncomfortably, unsure of where their loyalties lay. Elara, her gaze fixed on her father, continued. "You treated me as a pawn, Father. You discarded me, sacrificed me for your own political gain. You condemned me to a life of misery and abuse. Now it is my turn to collect my due." Alaric, his face contorted with fury, surged to his feet. "You will not get away with this, Elara!" he roared. "I will not let you steal my kingdom!" Elara laughed, a cold, mirthless sound that echoed through the hall. "Steal? Father, you wound me. I am merely claiming what is rightfully mine, what you promised me." She raised her hand, her voice ringing with a power that silenced any further protest. "Guards," she commanded. "Seize them!" Ari. The royal guards, their loyalty now firmly with Elara, moved swiftly, surrounding Alaric and his family. The queen let out a shriek of terror. Her siblings cried out in protest, but their voices were drowned out by the clatter of armor and the heavy thud of boots on the marble floor. Elara, her gaze fixed on her captured family, felt a surge of triumph. The Feast of Vipers had reached its climax. The hunters had become the hunted. And she, the silent princess, the discarded pawn, had emerged as the queen, the conqueror, the undisputed ruler of two kingdoms. The square buzzed with anticipation. A makeshift platform had been erected, draped in the royal colors of both Ethel and Alaric's kingdom, a deliberate display of Elara's newfound dominion. Crowds thronged the square, their faces a mixture of curiosity, fear, and morbid excitement. They had heard whispers of the deposed king and his family, of their imprisonment, of the impending trial. This was no ordinary trial, however. Queen Elara herself would preside, acting as judge, jury, and executioner. Elara, clad in a stark black gown that contrasted sharply with the ornate finery of the assembled nobles, ascended the platform. Her expression was impassive, her eyes cold and hard. The silence that had once been a mark of her vulnerability was now a weapon, a tool of intimidation. She surveyed the crowd, her gaze lingering on the faces of those who had once mocked and belittled her. They averted their eyes, their faces pale, their bodies trembling. "People of Ethel," she began, her voice amplified by a mystical force that resonated through the square, "and subjects of the former King Alaric, you have been summoned here today to witness justice." She paused, letting her words hang in the air, the silence amplifying the tension. "For years," she continued, her voice rising in intensity, "this kingdom, your kingdom, has suffered under the rule of a corrupt and incompetent monarch. King Alaric, blinded by his own ambition and vanity, neglected his duties, squandered the kingdom's resources, and allowed injustice to flourish." She turned her gaze towards her father, who stood in the center of the platform, bound and gagged, his face contorted with rage and humiliation. He surrounded himself with sycophants and flatterers. Elara continued, her voice dripping with contempt, ignoring the wise counsel of those who truly cared for the well-being of his people. He abused his power, enriching himself and his cronies, while the common folk suffered in poverty and despair. She gestured towards the queen and her siblings, who stood beside Alaric, their faces etched with fear and shame. His queen, obsessed with frivolous pursuits and petty rivalries, turned a blind eye to the suffering of her people. His children, spoiled and entitled, indulged in their own selfish desires, caring nothing for the burdens of leadership. Elara paused, her gaze sweeping across the crowd. "And what of me?" she asked, her voice laced with a raw pain that resonated with the crowd. His own daughter, silenced and discarded, treated as an inconvenience, a pawn to be sacrificed for political gain. He condemned me to a life of misery and abuse, marrying me off to a tyrant who delighted in my suffering. A collective gasp filled the square. The crowd, though accustomed to courtly intrigue and royal scandals, was shocked by Elara's revelations. They had known of her unhappy marriage, but they had never realized the extent of her suffering, the depth of her father's betrayal. Elara, fueled by their reaction, continued her indictment. She detailed Alaric's mismanagement of the kingdom's finances, his disastrous military decisions, his neglect of the people's welfare. She exposed the queen's extravagance, her cruelty towards those beneath her, her complicity in Alaric's corruption. She recounted the abuses she had suffered at the hands of her siblings, their taunts, their betrayals, their utter disregard for her well-being. Her words, amplified by her newfound power, resonated through the square, painting a damning portrait of a royal family that had betrayed its people, a family that deserved to be punished. "The time has come," Elara declared, her voice ringing with a chilling finality, "to hold them accountable for their crimes." She turned towards her father, her eyes burning with a cold, righteous fury. "Alaric," she said, her voice laced with contempt, "you have been found guilty of corruption, incompetence, and abuse of power. The sentence is death." Alaric, his gag removed, let out a roar of defiance. "You cannot do this, Elara!" he shouted. "I am your father! I am the king!" Elara's expression remained unchanged. "You were the king," she corrected him, her voice devoid of emotion. "Now you are nothing but a criminal, condemned by your own actions." She turned towards the executioner, who stood beside the platform, his axe gleaming in the sunlight. "Carry out the sentence," she commanded. The executioner, his face impassive, stepped forward. Alaric, his struggles futile, was forced to his knees. The queen and Elara's siblings, their faces pale with terror, watched in horror as the axe fell, ending Alaric's reign and his life. Elara, her gaze fixed on the scene, felt no remorse, no pity. This was justice, long overdue. This was retribution for years of suffering, for a lifetime of betrayal. And as she watched the executioner turn towards her mother and siblings, she knew that this was only the beginning. She would cleanse both kingdoms of corruption, of injustice, of anyone who dared to defy her rule. She was Elara, the tyrant queen, and her reign had just begun. The executions were swift and brutal. Elara watched, her face an impassive mask, as her mother, siblings, and a handful of their most loyal advisors met their end. The queen, her haughty demeanor finally shattered, pleaded for mercy, her cries echoing through the square. Elara's siblings, their arrogance replaced by abject terror, begged for their lives, their voices cracking with despair. But Elara remained unmoved. They had shown her no mercy, and she would offer them none in return. The crowd watched in stunned silence, the festive atmosphere of the victory feast a distant memory. The executions were a chilling spectacle, a stark reminder of Elara's ruthlessness, her absolute power. Some averted their eyes, unable to stomach the brutality. Others watched with a morbid fascination, their faces etched with a mixture of fear and awe. When the final axe fell, a hush descended upon the square. Elara, her black gown now splattered with blood, surveyed the scene, her gaze sweeping across the faces of her subjects. They looked at her with a mixture of fear, respect, and a grudging admiration. She had delivered them from the Calgarian invaders, but she had also shown them the true extent of her power, her willingness to use violence to achieve her goals. Elara, the silent princess, the discarded pawn, had become Elara, the tyrant queen, the undisputed ruler of two kingdoms. She had avenged her suffering, punished her tormentors, and secured her place in history. But at what cost? The years that followed were a time of peace and prosperity. Elara, a shrewd and capable ruler, implemented reforms that improved the lives of her people. She rebuilt the war-torn cities, revitalized the economy, and established a system of justice that, while harsh, was also fair and impartial. She was feared, but she was also respected. She had brought stability to a land that had long been plagued by conflict and instability, yet the memory of the executions lingered, a dark stain on her reign. Some whispered that she had become the very thing she had fought against, a tyrant who ruled through fear and intimidation. Others argued that her actions were justified, that she had merely done what was necessary to secure her power and protect her people. Elara herself remained an enigma. She ruled with an iron fist, but she also showed compassion and understanding. She was a complex and contradictory figure, a woman who had endured great suffering and emerged from it with a thirst for power and a desire for justice. As the years passed, Elara's legend grew. She was remembered as a warrior queen, a ruthless ruler, a savior, and a tyrant. Her legacy was a tapestry woven from both darkness and light, a testament to the complexities of human nature, the enduring power of vengeance, and the ambiguous nature of justice. And as the sun set on her reign, a question lingered in the air. Was Elara a just ruler, or had she become the very thing she fought against? The answer, like the woman herself, remained elusive, a mystery that would be debated for generations to come.